Hello and welcome to another edition of Rapid Reaction. I hope you're enjoying this video series, and if you particularly enjoy them, do remember please to rate them on YouTube or wherever you watch these videos. It really does help us. And if you aren't enjoying these videocasts, please forget I said anything. I'm wiping your mind at the moment because we really don't want negative ratings. But today I'm joined by my boss, Iain Martin, and we're discussing two topics: Scotland's place in the United Kingdom and the relationship between the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, and the Prime Minister. Iain, welcome to your podcast, your video. And can we start really by talking about Scotland? On the front page of the Times of London today is a report that at least one cabinet minister would like the referendum on Scotland's place in the United Kingdom not just to be a referendum that involves people living in Scotland, but Scottish people throughout the UK. Is this a good idea? Is it workable? What's your view?
Well, it's a really interesting notion. Thanks, Tim. Of course, this surfaced in the last Scottish referendum in 2014, when a lot of people like me, actually, who are Scottish with lots of family in Scotland and feel such a strong connection, didn't have a vote in the referendum that happened there. And ever since, there's been there have been suggestions that it should be different if there is another referendum. I found it curious because it's almost as though the message has not reached parts of the Conservative Party in London, and maybe some cabinet ministers, that actually the air has gone out of the SNP bubble since the recent devolution election, and there's a question even before: what should the franchise be, and should people in England who are Scottish be allowed to vote? The question is there going to be another independence referendum anytime soon? And of course, you can never say never. There could be some kind of economic emergency or some kind of constitutional emergency in 2 or 3 years' time, which somehow changes the calculation. But as it stands at the moment, there isn't going to be an independence referendum. Certainly not this side of a UK general election, because it is not remotely in Boris Johnson's interests to do it. He has a perfectly legitimate reason for saying that he's not doing it, which is that the SNP had said it would be a once-in-a-generation vote in 2014, and we're not even 10 years since then, never mind a generation. And also, the real thing which mattered in the Scottish election was that the SNP didn't get an overall majority. Now, it's very difficult to get an overall majority, but that was the trigger for David Cameron last time, really feeling that he had no choice other than to grant a referendum, which he then did. And there was the Edinburgh Agreement, the Edinburgh Accord, in which...
But Iain, let me interrupt you there briefly, though. Nicola Sturgeon, if she was here, would immediately say to you, though, that independent parties, with the Green Party north of the border, if you add them up with the SNP, pro-independence parties did win a majority in the Scottish Parliament.
But then you have to... But then a unionist would counter, well, but the Greens are a sort of pretendy party who only squeak in on the list. They're a sort of top up party. The decisive breakthrough made in the Scottish elections in 2011 was by Alex Salmond actually winning that overall majority. And at that point, unionists felt there's no option other than to grant a vote. I think the case there with the Greens, it sounds like quibbling, like trying to add two parties together to pretend that it's one. After everything that's happened with Boris Johnson being very unpopular in Scotland, with Nicola Sturgeon saying that Scotland is clamoring for an independence referendum, which it's not, when it came to it, with everything in the SNP's favour and the opposition parties in disarray, they failed to get an overall majority. Whether the government's position or Boris Johnson's position is entirely 100% correct or morally dubious or not, the practical political reality is that he has his cover to say no. Certainly, this side of an independent of a UK general election. Interestingly, in the Sunday Times yesterday, John Boothman, who knows Scottish politics inside out, really interesting report on various aspects of this, in which he pointed out that some senior people around the SNP leadership pretty much accept privately that there's no movement until you get a UK general election, which conceivably could be 2023, but is more likely to be 2024. So it's parked, I think, for at least 4 or 5 years. And if Boris Johnson carries on being Prime Minister, I think he'll find another excuse beyond that. So it's also unclear how Nicola Sturgeon, who keeps saying, and she's saying on Twitter today, possibly trying to divert from the OECD report on Scottish education, which illustrates that there are very serious problems there in terms of Scottish schools and reforms and improvements needed. She just declared, look, an independence referendum is going to happen, and pointed to this Times story saying, look, even the members of the cabinet concede that it's going to happen.
Because I think I would count probably in your list of out of touch Southern English Tory commentators, because I haven't noticed what you are describing, which is a change of mood in regard to this referendum. I take what you said about the SNP not winning an outright majority in the recent elections, but we kind of knew that in the 2 or 3 days after the result. And then, I remember, Andrew Marr leading on Sunday morning, immediately after the elections, with an interview with Nicola Sturgeon, Michael Gove trying to pour cold water on it. Certainly the BBC, at least, they weren't accepting your analysis then. Have we seen anything in sort of opinion polls? Has there been any movement at all on attitudes towards independence since then that is leading you to this conclusion, or is it just a sort of post-event reflection on everything that happened up until that point?
It's, of course, it's subjective, and a hardline Scottish nationalist would say, nonsense, Scotland is as desperate for independence as ever, and there is going to be a referendum next year. But how? It's
by the courts. The Nicola Sturgeon has talked about taking it to through the courts, and perhaps it could get a ruling in a sympathetic Scottish court, could she not?
But then there's the Supreme Court. It's the constitutional setup is really quite clear in terms of where authority rests on this. It rests with Westminster. The Constitution is a reserved matter deliberately, and Labour, when it was designing the Scottish Parliament setup, kept it that way. So Nicola Sturgeon, I'm sure the Scottish Parliament will pass a vote saying there must be an independence referendum, some say in 18 months' time. Nicola Sturgeon will then write a furious letter. Everything she does is in a spirit of fury, to Boris Johnson, saying, Scottish do not dare to stand in the way of the Scottish Parliament. There must be a referendum. And he'll write back under the section 30 provisions, and he'll write back and say no. It's then unclear what she can do other than going down the Catalan route, which is not advisable, because the EU, which the SNP wants to rejoin, would view an illegal referendum with great suspicion. And that's not what the EU wants to see. It wants a proper constitutional process if Scotland at some point leaves the UK and wants to rejoin the EU, and that an illegal referendum doesn't count. So
at least we could put Nicola Sturgeon in the Tower of London there if that happens. Can I just press you slightly though on the legal option? Just for a moment, assume that even if Nicola Sturgeon knows it's really unlikely to succeed as a strategy, but part of the SNP long-term vision must be to feed this constant argument that they're making anyway, that the institutions of the United Kingdom are against them, that Scotland isn't getting a fair deal. So actually pursuing the legal option but losing, and just sort of will build the whole idea that Scotland's voice is being suppressed in the United Kingdom. And so it might be in their interests as part of the long-term grievance strategy to go down that road anyway.
Or alternatively could do that for the reasons you describe and end up looking very silly, because if Boris Johnson says no, and there isn't a referendum granted under the Section 30 procedure, and the SNP attempts to, or someone else attempts to sort of mount a legal challenge to that, then the provisions are really clear. It is a decision for Westminster unless there is a vote at Westminster in favour of an independence referendum and granting it, instructing the government perhaps to open negotiations, which that's obviously not going to happen with a Tory majority of 80 or so. Mm. The route is then blocked, which Sturgeon and most senior nationalists, not being fools, will know that to get a Scottish independence referendum, they need Boris Johnson to say yes, that's okay. There should be one. Yeah. So the question about the franchise, which I have some sympathy with, though it's very difficult then to define precisely who's Scottish. Does someone who regards themselves as Scottish, but who happened to be born in England, now lives in England, but spent 30 years in Scotland, for example, in Scotland, do they count as fully Scottish because they now live again in London? I mean, it's unclear. I can see the emotional attraction of the idea, but I think it'd be very, very difficult to implement. But it is 2 or 3 steps, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years down the line. And of course, the reason that Nicola Sturgeon has to keep going on about this is that for a large part of her party, in fact, for her party in general, Scottish independence is the be-all and end-all of everything. So she has to be seen to be banging the independence drum. She this weekend appointed Mike Russell, former cabinet minister in the Scottish government, Scottish executive, to head up a new drive on independence, and that's to suggest to the party membership that something's actually happening. And there will be lots of stamping and shouting, and Ian Blackford will be furious as he always is. Yeah, and exactly. Mike Russell will give
how will we notice the difference if
and Mike Russell will give speeches on how England is this is no longer a union of equals and all the rest of it, and the planning will happen, but it is very difficult, not impossible, but very difficult to see how the SNP gets from that righteous indignation in its terms to Boris Johnson saying, "Hands up, okay, you can have your referendum." The longer term or medium and longer term question for unionists is, and you asked me, Tim, what brings me to this view, and I was really quite gloomy about the prospects, or worried about the prospects, when it seemed that the SNP could get an overall majority, and they just fell short by 1 seat. But I'm not being complacent from a unionist perspective. There's a lot that needs fixing, and the question for unionists is what they decide to do with that time that's been bought by the SNP falling short. Whether
we should move on, Iain, to another topic, but our second topic, but just final question, which is probably on this area, which is a very hard one, because we don't know what events might lie immediately ahead. But how much trouble and how much quickly could Nicola Sturgeon get into difficulties with her own party if she doesn't deliver any progress on this independence referendum? Because there are hardliners in her party, aren't there, who feel that she's been too softly already. Yeah. If it doesn't pay any dividends soon, because the amazing thing for me about the SNP, really, we've obviously had the Alex Salmond row in the last 6 months, which has been ugly, but the overall unity of the SNP, at least from an outsider such as myself, has been pretty impressive, given they've been in government for such a long time in Holyrood. But are there signs of serious discontent that could explode and could really cause the SNP trouble?
Potentially. I mean,
Sturgeon trouble.
Sturgeon, having survived the whole Salmond business, is in a strong position internally, certainly relative to 6 months ago. But there's that strand of Salmondite opinion, although Salmond, of course, is not in the SNP anymore and set up his own rather unsuccessful vehicle. But yes, there are hardliners, whether it's a quarter to a third, who might want to go down the Catalan route or be really aggressive about it. But I think the question then for Sturgeon is what's her appetite for going on beyond it. If I'm right, and a referendum is not round the corner, and nothing I've seen convinces me that there is going to be a referendum soon, then does she want to stay on for 4, 5, 6, 7 years? And it's getting more and more difficult on questions like education and the SNP's record on health and the economy and business. So does she have the appetite for all of that, that extra spell in office? And then if Sturgeon goes, another thing which hasn't really been picked up in London is the question of the SNP succession, where there isn't really anyone obvious. It's as often happens, the Tories may find this out as well, is that after a very strong leader, someone who's built almost a cult of personality, it is often the case that that leader has not then grown the next generation and grown a successor generation in terms of cabinet positions and leadership potential. Sturgeon is the end of that partnership gone wrong now. Salmond and Sturgeon has been the dominant fact of SNP life for 15 years. And if and when Sturgeon goes, and all leaders have to go eventually, it's unclear that the SNP have anyone half as adept as Sturgeon ready to take over.
Look, we should move on to the, you mentioned the succession battle of the future in the SNP. We should look at the succession issues between Rishi Sunak and Boris Johnson. But I am now feeling guilty about this discussion, Iain, because we've been discussing the independence referendum, and you mentioned the OECD report on Scottish fair and education, and probably if we were really focusing on the fundamental issues, that's what we should have been discussing. But we're going to have to come back to that for another day, because the independence discussion is still very interesting. But Iain, you wrote a really good piece in your Regular Times column last week, looking at Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and he's had a busy few days. He had a quite a tricky interview with Andrew Neil on GB News middle of week last week. The Sunday Times has run a story in the last 24 hours about tensions between numbers 10 and 11 Downing Street. And, it wasn't so long ago that the Chancellor of the Exchequer looked sort of the odds-on favourite to be the next Prime Minister, and potentially quite quickly, particularly when Boris Johnson seemed to be, really struggling in opinion polls. We've now got a situation where Boris is riding high, despite Chesham and Amersham, and suddenly some of the decisions that Rishi Sunak has made, he's really alienated a lot of backbenchers because of the aid budget cuts. He certainly alienated me. I will struggle to ever forgive what we have done, even if you support a smaller aid budget. To cut the aid budget in the middle of programs being in place, without giving countries any option to actually find alternative funding for life-saving programs, I think it's one of the worst things the Conservative government has done for a long time, and Rishi Sunak drove that policy. But tell us, if you can, just give us not that specific litmus test that I'm almost applying to the Chancellor, but what are the contours of why this Rishi Boris tension is now sort of on the front page of newspapers and appearing in comment articles?
Well, I think there's this sense, isn't there, that after all of the spending, the great splurge, which of course, Rishi Sunak had to do a lot of that stuff in terms of furlough, and you can see the advantage in terms of protecting employment and protecting certain industries. But now we're approaching the end of this phase of the pandemic, and some restoration of normal life. At some point, you have to start applying normal calculations and normal standards to public spending decisions. And he sees it, and the Treasury see their role. Its Treasury always, I suppose, sees its role as to say no to number 10. But it's particularly acute this time because number 10 has a prime minister who loves spending money. I mean, he's not a Thatcherite, he's a Heseltine. And he has Heseltine style grand project ideas. Plus he likes government spending programs in general. And the Treasury view is that the Prime Minister finds it very difficult to say no to anyone or anything. And the story of the last few weeks and months has been the Chancellor trying to educate, if you like, the Prime Minister in this reality that the spending on this scale and borrowing on this scale cannot continue forever. Also, you've got the personality dynamic, which is that when Sunak was very, very strong last year and last autumn, it was perfectly plausible to say that it didn't look as though Boris might not even fight the next election. Maybe that sounds silly now, but remember pre-vaccine and remember how much trouble he appeared to be in last summer and last autumn. There was this ready-made successor signing everything Rishi, rather than
I hated that, by the way. That is when I really began my doubts about Rishi. Calling him Rishi, though, is probably what he wanted us to do. But that's when my doubts about Rishi really grew. It seemed that he was far too focused on marketing and his own personality, really, and he wasn't even signing these things that a Conservative government was committing to with Conservative branding. It was Rishi all in the little pink and everything else. It was that's my general worry. We discussed this before on these broadcasts. That's been my general worry with this Conservative government, full stop. There's too much focus on comms and opinion polls and marketing and not enough on substance. So at least for once, we're talking about a substantial debate between numbers 10 and 11. But you're presenting it very much as sort of a dispute between numbers 10 and 11, which of course it is, and it often is. But where are the rest of the cabinet lining up? Or do you tell us the cabinet? Yes, exactly.
The cabinet. Yes, I remember the cabinet. They used to meet once a week and be quite a big thing in government.
Yeah, as did Parliament, but that's another thing.
But don't bother with Parliament now. We've moved on from all of that. We just have government by statutory instrument. Yeah,
I'm just a traditionalist at heart.
But I think
are the spending cabinet ministers part of this discussion at all, or are we really at the stage where it is only those two figures that are going to slug this whole debate out?
Well, yeah. The other complication is the reshuffle. So I'm sure. Well, I know because several got in touch last week about various things we've said on these broadcasts. So if there are cabinet ministers watching this, then I know I sounded glib there, and some of them are, concerned, and will see it as their role to get involved in these debates. But everything is coloured at the moment just by will they or won't they survive the reshuffle, which people expected was coming 2-3 weeks ago. Didn't materialize around the time of the great sort of Cummings explosion. So Boris has that over pretty much all the cabinet, other than Rishi, Sunak. Others are everyone is dispensable in one way or another, and some members of the cabinet who might have concerns about some of what's going on in public spending and the status direction of the government nonetheless want to be promoted in the reshuffle. So Boris is king, not quite world king as he always said he wanted to be when he was a child, but he's even despite Chesham and Amersham politically dominant, and I don't think he'll get, I could be wrong, I mean, tell me if you think I'm wrong, I don't think he'll get too much grief out of this cabinet while they wait to find out whether they're axed or not.
No, I think that's probably fair. Iain, we could go on for a lot longer, but I think we should wrap it up now. Thanks as always for you watching, and please do take a look at the reaction if you're new to reaction. There's lots of written products there and lots of things we hope you can enjoy. If you're not a regular subscriber, you can access the site for free for a month during an experiment we're running. And please do rate us on YouTube, as I've invited you to at the beginning of this video. But also, you know, do leave comments for us under the videos, and also via Twitter. We do not necessarily respond to every comment, but we do try and read them all. And so your feedback really is important to us. But most of all, thank you for watching, and we'll be back tomorrow. Bye for now.